I'm hoping that this is quite a discursive session, in some part because I only have 15 content slides, so if we really need to stretch that out, some robust interaction would be helpful. And this is not really intended to be a lecture. This is intended to be a conversation, hopefully an interesting conversation. So it was very interesting to hear Ken Fisher talk yesterday about some of the things that are happening in teaching and learning. It's been a space that I've been engaging with increasingly probably over the last 10 years. And for much of that time trying to figure out what some of the words that all come from ancient Greek actually mean. Amusingly, half of them are really badly misused, like pedagogy, which is technically teaching children, not teaching adults. The number of vice-chancellors who talk about our changes in pedagogy and sit there slightly grimacing. But what is clear is that there are changes afoot and disruptive changes at that, and that those changes, look, it's going to become pretty clear from this presentation that I, after 20 years, have developed a little bit of a chip on my shoulder about all the things that change and generally make my life harder. So you might find that as a throughput. Please don't pick that up. That's my heavy stone to carry, but I'm sure some of you carry that stone as well. Albeit probably more stylishly and with greater grace. Okay, aims of this presentation, which we probably won't necessarily hit, but we'll try anyway. So for those of you who are new to this space or don't talk about space, a little bit of a crash course in talking space, those inscrutable facilities planning people whom you either work with all the time or work with as little as possible, but they're there. And we do have our own special way of talking. Actually, in many contexts, that includes a lot of swearing, but that's generally when you're talking to site foremen, so we'll try not to reflect that today. Some idea of some thought starters really are the leverage that you can gain from your timetable data. So how can we use the data that we have to try and help fix some of these problems or promote changes? Because often we can't change them directly. All we can try and do is influence the person who can change them directly. Or as often happens, influence the person who can influence the person who can influence the person who can change them directly. And a summary of some of the key challenges that I've faced, I guess, over the last 10 years, and some thoughts on how I should have responded to those and probably didn't for the first 7 or 8 of those years. So a crash course and some leverage. Fundamental principles. And let's ignore staff for a second. Actually, no, with your permission, can we ignore academic staff for the rest of the presentation? They're a challenge all in of themselves, but not necessarily the most directly relevant here. There is, of course, a tension between the needs of our students and what's achievable in terms of the usage of our space. The tension is difficult to represent. It's not direct. We can describe it directly. The happier our students are, generally, would expect to have a diminishing effect on how heavily we drive our asset in our space. And it's important sometimes to reinforce that to people, because our managers like to believe they can have everything. And they like to believe that because they don't actually have to deliver the end product, so they can believe they can have everything. And we need to be able to create an opposing dialogue. You can have what you want, but you need to understand what you will trade off in order to achieve it. So when I talk to senior management, I'm always talking about this will mean this, or this may require a trade-off with this. And I found that to be quite effective over the last 5 years. We, again, here is the chip on the shoulder, the heavy stone. We find ourselves in the middle of that tension between the needs of the student and the needs of the space. Now, I mean, quick show of hands, who's in a student management, student administration context for their timetable team? I should do a quick count, but I'm just really winging it. And people in a space planning context? Is anyone anywhere else? Can you tell us, please? Academic. Brilliant. Yep. No, I will expand on that, sorry, but there was another hand?
We ended up in IT.
In IT? That is the first I've heard of that. To expand on what could otherwise have been seen as glib, I think academic is a really interesting context. It enables a lot of other opportunities. Our DVCE, when I was most recently employed at an institution, was broadly terrifying, but she was also extremely useful once she realised that I wasn't going to stand in the way of her agenda and that my agenda wasn't actually directly competing with it. But academic is where a lot of the changes that we see that could disrupt our practice, our industry, are happening. So it's potentially a really great place to be. And I know that some of our most talented timetablers are now assisting within an academic planning context, which I think is great to see. So a little bit, not quite half and half. I think we've got more student context these days than planning or space planning context. I suppose the point I'd make is it doesn't really matter where we are because this is still our heavy stone to bear. It is still us who have to represent and manage this tension between the needs of the student, the many, and the needs of the space. Unfortunately, while students have actual voices, from a corporate perspective, it's the voice of the space which has been a dominant one. So we've used space utilisation, as a shorthand for timetabling performance throughout pretty much my entire career. And that's getting on a little bit. Now, institutions generally in Australia and New Zealand will use the TEFMA calculation method for calculating the utilisation of that space. So, quick show of hands, who knows what the TEFMA method is and what TEFMA is? It's most of you? Okay, it's not everyone. I didn't even look at John, I think he helped write them. So, the TEFMA method for calculating the use of space is pretty dominant. One of the things I'd note about it is for several years it's actually been licensed as data and provided to federal government. So academic institutions, Australian institutions, are actually required to provide a TEFMA return. It's, to my way of thinking, a little bit elastic because while we're required to use a common frame for the data, there are lots and lots of different ways in which each institution may decide to colour or best present the data that they use. But this is data that exists. If you're an institution in Australia, it's going to government, it's being collected every year. So, what is the TEFMA framework? Now, apologies, my computer believes utilisation should be spelt with an S. I, for some reason, still believe it should be spelt with a Z. I'm sure I should have provided like Minties. If people can find I've got the wrong one, just let me know. I'll buy Minties later if you find one. Okay, so the TEFMA framework for measuring this. Frequency of use. And it was really interesting to hear the presentation from our Canadian colleagues because they talk about utilisation, but I think it's a different context to what we might discuss. So frequency of use is the number of hours asset, room, location, anything really, is used compared to the number of hours that it's determined to be available. That's pretty simple. If we run a teaching span which is 50 hours and we use our room for 40 of those hours, our frequency of use is 80%. A lot of universities talk about frequency of use, probably too much. We have occupancy, which is the number of seats used compared to the seats available. So if this theatre holds 120 people and there are 80 of us here, actually I should have just picked something easier. 120, 80, someone's got a spreadsheet, you can do the math. I'd guess, but I'd be wrong by a couple of points. And utilisation, which is the product of these two things. Now, what has become obvious, and John will probably reflect this too, is that this has become a shorthand for our management, but not all of our management actually really understand these measures well or don't understand them separately. So people will commonly talk about frequency or they'll commonly talk about utilisation. Not enough people talk about occupancy, but they're telling you really quite distinctly different things. I would describe occupancy talks about the relative match between the size of your delivery planning and the size of your delivery settings. But if a university comes to me and says, I want to drive 90% occupancy of my space, I'll say, well, unless you're an ELI school or a business school, that might be really hard to achieve because we've got a mix of spaces. Old universities have a tremendous mix of design settings because they've been built up over 100 years. Some of them are still standing, haven't been changed since. We've also got, very disaggregated areas doing curriculum planning, all with different base sizes, group sizes, enrolment thresholds. It's impossible necessarily to mandate or require a really high match in some of those things some of the time. Even within this accepted framework, which is really common, we can see that there's a lot of variation. And this is where I think timetabling needs to assert its voice. So decisions on the sample that we use for this. A lot of institutions will use a 1-week sample. We've got 52 weeks of the year, I'll find the one which is most heavily used and bang. That's not valid, but makes the institution look good. Utilisation looks high. We probably have the best sense of what is a relevant sample of data for the institution to use to create this really, really important and very commonly used sort of management information. And there are lots of decisions. So which weeks and which hours, what is a common week? If we have a teaching free period, we need to make sure that that's factored in. Do we include just course delivery? Do we include our ad hoc bookings? Do we have maintenance bookings? Do we include those? Do we include the relative availability of facilities? What happens if it's taken off 3/4 of the year or brought on halfway through the year? Are we ensuring all of those things are accounted for? This is a big one and becoming bigger. Do we use planned data or allocated data or audited data? Now, we've always wanted to use the most accurate sample possible, but there is a tension between some of these figures that we can't afford to be naive about. If we use audited data, and I audit on the 7th week of semester, my utilisation is going to look really low. I once asked, which is uncharacteristically brave of me, in an executive meeting, whether the university was obligated to provide a seat for every student who had enrolled on campus. I think I asked that question very nervously in 2015. The answer I received then, and I suspect it may be being evaluated every year, was yes. So if you enrol on campus, you enrol at the University of Adelaide on this campus, it's our expectation that whether you turn up or not, we need to provide a seat for you. So utilisation is, audited utilisation is really critical, but it's not necessarily telling us something we can use as a lever for our planning. This is another big one. I've tried to do this at 2 institutions and probably haven't completely succeeded at either. But to participate in an exercise where we define and agree a functioning space typology. Now what we find is TEFMA have a space category and typology, but it's not really designed at the level of specific teaching use that we might need it to be. The group of 8, because they're the group of 8, and my apologies to the members, but they went out and defined their own. And it's different, characteristically different, but again, it's more functional. These are functional definitions and they have a great utility where they're used in space planning and space management data sets, but they're not effective for what we do, which is join needs to settings. So the other thing is that this space is developing rapidly. And there's a whole new set of terminology and no one uses the same set of terminology. So, this is difficult. If I'm a staff member and I ask for a PBL space, that might mean something different if I'm in engineering compared to something different if I'm in a medical science, because I might actually provide a slightly different setting, use the same term. We can't afford that level of inspecificity. Neither can we afford, 400 labels describing every room atomically, because then that would give us no basis for optimization. This we need to be bought into, this we need to control. So what can we do with this space data? We can observe current performance. That's been its most typical use over most of the last 20 years. We can do what certain institutions are doing, which is marry together this sample over years and look for trends. Do I see this cohort of demand increasing? Is this one decreasing? We've been looking for a trend for years that hasn't been turning up, which I'll get to in one of the next slides. And what I argue, or have started to argue, probably should I stop arguing less, okay. But we can use this data to start to create our forecast models. Now I went to a TEFMA presentation, it must have been 10 years ago, and someone did what was a tremendously facilitating and energizing presentation for me, because she put up on a slide all of these things, the development of the internet, that's the one I remember, there were others. And then she challenged everyone and said, who could have predicted, 10 years ago where these things were going? And, we're all wired this way. We said, no one could have predicted that. And she said, wrong. All of those changes were predictable if we were just looking at the right data, looking at the right trend adoption. And, I was really challenged by that, because I was in that space of, it's all happening and I have no control, and what can I do? I can do the one thing I can do. I can look at the data. I can look at what's happening. This is a bit different. This is something I started preparing at Deakin, because we had to manage all of our capital works. And people would say, I'll just do it, at the end of semester 2, and then nothing happens really till the start of semester 1. I said, well, 1, we've run a trimester model for years, so that's not right. But 2, that's what a year looks like. So you tell me where exactly you can take 30% of my estate offline and do something horrendous to it. And that's the reality. It's the response to that question I'm sure we've all been asked, well, hopefully not everyone, but many of you, by some well-meaning academic or senior management, well, so what do you do for the rest of the year after you've published the timetable? So forecasting, to the extent that we did it, it did used to be easier, which was the nice lower barrier to entry. The things that we would model would be growth, or negative growth, and changes to a state. We can broadly assume relatively linear rates of change moving from year to year. And we can assume relatively simple use of TEFMA planning benchmarks. Especially early on, we just said, it's 75 and 75, or it's 50 and 75, that's it. So this is an example of what I have been working on in the past in terms of using a simple linear projection model. So I might look at, what's a university growth forecast, maybe a low range or a low band one. Look at, a simple typology breakdown of my space, and then look at the next 5 years, and do I actually see us going into deficits? Now I madden people because I break things down to the lowest common increment. That's strategic, because if I start talking about spaces, rooms, settings, actually start to blancmange into other people's areas. So it's been helpful to me sometimes to be able to use a lowest common denominator expression. So I often use seats, a seat of capacity. So a seat of capacity is if I have to deliver 100 student seat contact hours, and I have 10 hours a week, and I have a space that seats 10 people. I don't just need one room, I need to factor in the fact I can't use that room 100% of the time, or I can't use 100% of those seats. So we can use those planning benchmarks to actually, it's a grossing ratio effectively, we can bulk out. So we can say, yeah, in a perfect world, if you drove your asset to 100% utilisation, it would be this. We've got some planning measures and we can figure out what's the delta, what's the difference there. So this is a simple report, linear forecast. When do I start running out of space in a certain category? So if this sample of data, we started to run low of lecture space by about 2023, would go into an active deficit, a small one. A small deficit doesn't worry me. It's when you see these charts where the lines below the zero are really low, that's where I start freaking out. Could be argued I freak out somewhat easily. Now it's getting more complicated. We need to factor in delivery changes based on pedagogy. There I said it, it is the wrong word, but it's become so common, well, just let me get away with it. There are increased number of variables for us to factor in, and the rate of change may well not be linear. I have been arguing for the last 4 or 5 years that what we're looking at is a change adoption curve, similar to something like smartphone use. And a change adoption curve is defined by a low rate of change in early years of adoption. The deltas are quite hard to see. Then you have a massive uptick, because once those early adopter phases are actually worked through, people jump on board quite quickly. Then you have an equally steep tailing off period, and then you've got the Luddite, change-averse, what do they call them in this one? The adversaries who really don't want the change. Now, I think we could probably apply that to our academic cohort relatively consistently. There is a different adoption curve which I like to put up at this point. This is what I experience with any change we need to manage, which is more the emotional curve: complain, plead, sulk, accept. We almost never get to the fourth quadrant, unfortunately, unless they're beaten into submission. Okay, I need to pick up the pace because alarmingly I'm actually taking longer to deliver this than I anticipated, so my apologies. So, delivery change. Those of you unfortunate enough to be here on Tuesday heard me wax lyrical about how universities made our life harder by deregulating our curriculum. There's lots of words there, too many. How many people here find that they struggle with a very under-regulated curriculum and effectively struggle to get good student sets, pathways as a consequence of that change? Good, good. More people carrying the stone. I'm really happy. The outcome is timetabling is harder. That's the outcome for us. So, and this is an example, and these are thought starters. This is not a resolved strategy. Don't go and say, David said to say this to your management. But I started to say, okay, well, it is your choice. Offer an unstructured curriculum. That's fine. And it's not my place to talk about the potentially horrendous bad learning outcomes or employment outcomes that become a consequence of that. What I can tell you is if you continue to offer that, I only have 2 plays in my book. Sorry, not smart enough to offer any others. One, I can reduce our operating targets for room frequency. Because if you're going to give me a highly student-constrained problem, I'm not going to be able to pack it at 75% or 80%, certainly nothing near 90%. I'm going to be hovering around 60 or 50 because there's simply not enough hours in the day to satisfy that range of combinations. Or I'm going to trade off against my student experience. I'm going to move to a higher set point for what do I consider relevant. More units in the combination or more students on the combination. What am I doing? I'm trading off student experience. It's probably not that direct, but they don't need to know that. The other one is ensuring we're mining that data so we're sharing the pain. Report on that problem. Report on the number of students doing a unique combination relative to the number doing a rare combination, relative to the number doing a really well-attended combination. Cheryl, I am looking at you. I know you've done this. But, I think it's a really inspiring example. It's an opportunity to use data that we can mine, that we have to use every day, that we know well, to try and share and broaden understanding of a problem that often people managing curriculum may not have engaged with that problem in that way. Intensive and variable delivery. Where's Newton? There she is. She's holding up tremendously well under the strain of having to implement a block model, across all years of enrolment. And, it's my old alma mater and I'm rooting for them. It is a tremendous transformation of the education industry, but, it is very difficult, Newton might tell you, from what I can tell, to accommodate. Now, not a block mode delivery, but I was modelling the same change at Deakin. We started to look at, as a percentage, how many of our deliveries were retaining their 11 or 10 week repeating pattern, and how many were breaking that down. And before I started reporting that, I think the first time I started to report that was in 2017. In semester 2, I had 47% of my delivery that was non-regular. And that number was trending up. And I had to say to people, whoa there, pickle, this is getting quite hard to manage, please. Is there something we could do about this? Yeah, hence outcome, timetabling is harder, stone heavier. Recommendation. Mine was panic. I run around shouting, I'm a teapot. Yes, I'm of a certain age, I watch the goodies. Then measure. So, to what extent is this problem? How much evidence base can I actually give as colour to the story? And then said, okay, well, could we start to normalise or organise this into a framework? If you're going to tell me I'm teaching of 5 or 6 weeks of delivery, I'm going to put you on alternating weeks or first half, second half. If you want 3 or 4 week blocks, I'm going to move into thirds or quartiles in terms of breaking up my delivery period. If you can come along the way with me to that extent, then I can possibly normalise this into delivery planning that I can work through. And again, reference to like a weekly histogram, which shows me a standard deviation line, so I can know what's a really peaky week, what's a really under week. I can start to try and align this to where I think I might be able to survive if we keep going that way. It's all about leveraging the data. Last bit, and it probably applies to all of it, was you might need to find a senior friend who's adopted you or likes you, or you have some incriminating evidence on, to help support that change. Active learning. So this is what we call it a deacon. Could be social learning, peer-based learning, blended learning. And there's probably actually a broader term discovering a number of more specific changes. But what it is an increase in peer-based or social learning models, as well as authentic learning models. Now, generally it's understood that there may be a compensating reduction in passive delivery. So we're not necessarily expecting to deliver more to students, we're just changing the canisters a little bit. Unfortunately, most of the time the outcome of this might be timetabling is harder. Stone heavy. So this is happening, maybe at low levels or high levels of rate of change. The thing I'd say is that teaching and learning often get to be a lovely champion cheerleader for this change and don't need to set hard targets. Push them. That's their job. If they want to manage this change, manage the change. You can't afford for it to happen naively because you'll end up with demand spiking and you've got no supply against it. It's not a nice place to be. The other one is talk to early adopters. Try and get a sense of who's driving it, finding champions. But work with them and say, well, it's good, but we can't afford for everyone to do this at the one time. So changes that occur because of that change in delivery. We might see an increase in large format peer-to-peer settings. So this is actually Flinders, so apologies, Cheryl. That's Cheryl's room. Yeah. That excites me from a spacey planning person perspective. I think that's a really interesting setting because you've got multiple modes, you've got some tiering which gives you good sight lines, you've got different settings for different modes of operation. But we expect to see more of these things, but they cost more space. If you're replacing a lecture and tutorial model with an active collaboration model, you're going from settings which bulk out at 2, maybe 1, 1.5, to something which, Ken was showing there's a range here, but it's around 3, maybe to 2.7.
Those 2 rooms, I would say that utilization was right around about 30% of that, and now that 1 room is up around 80% now.
One of the things I'd say about that change adoption curve is I would argue we're already past the uptick, but what's happened is our capacity constrains that change, which makes it harder because that change could be driven much more explosively. It's like pressure on a bottle. If we break that top, then we'll lose all our soda. It's probably good for our health, but nothing else. So examples of this large collaborative setting. Studio spaces, super labs, flexible use venues with different configuration options and capacities. John mentioned some of the work that was done to enable refit of something from a tiered setting back to a flat-floored setting. Because one of the things you've got to do here is you've got to dial in and dial out. So that strategy is extremely effective. Unfortunately, the impact, of course, is timetabling is harder. Probable space changes. Now, I've been hearing this one for 10 years and the evidence is just not saying it happening. But there should be a reducing demand for large lecture spaces. I'm not seeing it often in the data that I look in when I look at this problem. I don't know what you're seeing.
What we're seeing is that they still require them, but they just require them for a shorter amount of time because the students take the content through Echo. So they're booked for 12 weeks or 14 weeks. Yep. They really only use it for 2, 3.
The huge challenge here is that these spaces are really hard to repurpose to do anything else. So, in terms of agilely managing your estate, they're a nightmare. We should be also seeing a reduction in small group settings because one of the economic changes that are required to manage this is if you change from a 300 capacity lecture to 60 capacity studios, that 300 capacity lecture probably bulks out at 400 something metres squared over a double height volume. to supply that in a 3 metre squared studio, you're talking about a substantial increase in the spatial footprint for that delivery. There's also an almost equally substantial increase in the contact cost to deliver that. One person standing here for an hour delivering content they've been doing since the 80s could be quite cheap. You know, getting people to deliver that in a peer-based learning setting with a greater emphasis on the preparation materials, that's going to cost some coin. We've got to figure out how that happens. And as I mentioned before, not all spaces can be adapted easily. More changes. I'm going to start racing here because I'm over time. My apologies. In-session rescheduling. This is going to raise its head sooner or later. Someone's going to say that we should start to actually re-optimise our delivery even in session.
One university senior management has already asked the timetabling team to do that.
Yeah.
I've been asked several times, why don't you reschedule at week 3 or week 4?
I've said to them, why bother? So you reschedule and you get the students into smaller and smaller rooms because there's fewer of them there. What are you going to do with the large lecture theatres that are suddenly available for 8 weeks?
Exactly. So this change will be driven harder once point 2 happens. Late occurring agile demands. So John is exactly right. You know, that's exactly the response I gave to my executive when they raised that with me. I said, well, what are you going to do with the space? You're going to churn a lot of people, piss everyone off, and you're going to do nothing with it. That's a good point.
That's what they said to me. I said it's silly.
And I've looked at that. The operating cost saving from air conditioning relative to the capital cost, and then the opportunity. Yeah.
I agree.
Yes.
For individual rooms scattered around in large buildings.
Yeah.
Got individual rooms to spread them through.
Yeah.
No, I mean, a lecture theatre is one room in a large building.
Yeah.
If they save air conditioning on just this one room, they've still got to air condition the rest of the building with the offices and everything else.
There's also the problem that most of us haven't got smaller rooms sitting there empty.
Exactly. So,
There is a massive assumption that you've got all of that additional space empty for when you reschedule after week 3 or 4.
yeah. I think increasingly we'll see the needle move on some of these things. So if we have to do rescheduling, we're starting to see technologies that'll actually manage that or help us manage that problem. We'll see active redirection through notification frameworks and wayfinding. So students won't care. If you change their room, they'll get a notification, like, okay. So long as they're happy with the setting.
So it would be a day and time to get the room.
That's a good point. Okay, so we will...
Just one point to note there. The universities are probably in a, I'll call it a luxury position, that the rooms are yours. There are institutes like TAFE institutes where the rooms are actually owned by the government, and the TAFEs are owned by the government to do just that, reschedule and free up those rooms to make them available to private providers and industry groups, because the government can then charge them for the use of those rooms and make money out of it. So there are institutes that are forced to do that now and make those rooms available.
We'll start to see that sector-wide. I mean, already space teams will be making active decisions and discussions about what do we borrow, what do we build, what do we lease. Because there's a higher variability we're aiming at here, so we need agile options. Okay, let's sprint. We're starting to see smarter built environments that can actually tell us when they're being used. And we'll see an increasing mix of use of space, so formal, informal, opportunistic. The last one is when it's a formal venue, I've got a sign, it tells me it's free, and I go in there until someone comes in to use it. Really rich and important. Also a richer level of detail on what's actually happening in the space. So what software and equipment settings am I using? How many people are in the room? How do they move through the room? We're going to be able to start to sense some of these things in real time. Some strategy suggestions, and I'm glad Fred took a nap because I'm 5 minutes over time. Okay, and these are suggestions. Again, you know, I'm no guru. I've just got grey hair. Own your data, even if others use it. And if they have their own data, set yours up in opposition. I know that sounds, you know, fighty, but I actually really believe in it. Seek out your support. Stalk them. PVCs, teaching and learning, space management, you know, you need to find friends because it's about influencing the person who can influence the person who can make the change happen. Share your problems. Don't suffer in silence. Don't bear the stone like I did. I used to be 6'3". No, I didn't. And start forecasting. I would say that. Start looking ahead. Start saying, help. It might not be a problem now, but in 2 years, you're going to wish you listened to me. You know, no one wants to miss a chance to say, I told you so, me least of all. Apologies for going so far of the time and for talking so much, but thank you so much for your attention.